In many ways, this is both the perfect time and the worst time for me to join you all here. It is perfect in the sense that I'm engaged in a moment of study myself, and it is the worst time because I'm engaged in a moment of study myself. And so my presentation tonight is both an experiment and a public confession of a private thought process that reflects much of the work I've done for the past almost 20 years, and at a moment in which will have stopped long enough to both examine the work that has often been done in real time as a matter of methodology, as well as the larger framework that I'm looking to articulate as I go forward. I've spent my entire life living in different secret environments, as a woman, as a person of color, as a child of global post-colonial migration, as a child of interracial parents in a certain time period, as a grandchild of war. And so it's a chicken or the egg question. Do I live outside of documentation in some way because I choose to, or because I always have? I don't necessarily see my job and my life as separate. I've constructed it as a kind of Ouroboros, never-ending cycle of idea, action, home, work, influence, making, and doing. My mother was a Catholic nun for 8 years at the height of liberation theology in the 1960s. I think she saw this as her way out, her rebellion against her family, but it was also a true manifestation of how she wanted to engage with the world from a perspective of care. She joined a radical social justice-oriented order called Maryknoll, which had a heavy presence in Latin America alongside the Jesuits, who had begun to question the political relationship between the church and state in repressing the poor by promoting the promise of heaven. Eventually, the Vatican suspended all missions to Latin America in response to liberation theology, and my mother left the church in protest. My father was an Ethiopian Orthodox priest for 11 years. He was also a chaplain in the Ethiopian Air Force and a paratrooper who was trained in a secret mission by the Israeli army in Haifa in the 1950s in anticipation of a proxy war with Egypt. In the late 60s, he left Ethiopia at the request of the church and the Emperor Haile Selassie to establish a church in Trinidad and Tobago that still stands today. He found his way to the US eventually and was introduced to the active civil rights movement there and grew frustrated with the political organization of the church, met my mother, and then left. They married in 1971. An interracial marriage at that time, even in New York City, was not common, and they each made their choice to essentially walk away from their pre-existing social structures in order to be together. I'm not sure how much either of them questioned it, and they now joke about the racism that, in some sense, acted as a frame for their lives. But in many ways, they were following a path of rebellion and dissatisfaction that was as much based in love as it was a politic. While each of them maintained their independent critique of the church, and we didn't even grow up with the Bible in the house, they raised our family with the ideals in which they each entered their religious experience: an egalitarian, constructive, future-facing aspiration for a new kind of society. They didn't have a language for any of their ideas. They didn't know any theory. Liberation theology was informed by Marxism, but their religious lives were about praxis, doing more so than theorizing. So I think of them as a sort of pair of unknowing or intuitive, almost anarchists. And as a kid, I was more or less encouraged to figure out on my own the way of being, as long as I understood service, empathy, and engaged in politics. I was an environmental activist and a social being. I cared enough about actual school to get decent grades, but I was much more interested in the social aspects of learning, not fully understanding the examples that my parents had set, of not simply accepting the structures that had tried to predetermine their own existences, but understanding that boundaries needed to be tested and reconceived. I will fast forward to college for a little bit, where I studied linguistics and Russian. I attended a pretty much exclusive Chomskyan linguistics program, studied closely with a Basque anarchist who is now the provost of the school where I was enrolled, where we learned about language through the study of hierarchies and governance. It was simultaneously a study of generative grammar and a larger metaphor for analyzing power structures. I was a poor student in details, but a good student in paying attention to the bigger picture that, to the frustration of my teachers, was not actually the point. While I was an undergraduate, I also worked full-time as an administrator in the graduate student office in the physics department, and it wasn't until much later that I realized the enormous passive yet internalized effect that this experience had on my thinking. Chomsky was the frame for looking at hierarchies, but the physics department is where I learned about experimentation, abstraction, and the urgent desire to not simply rest on what we know about the world, but to attempt to give shape to the things which aren't yet real as a way of understanding it and changing it. After college, I moved to Seattle with my then partner, a physicist, and began working as an administrative assistant to the director and founder of a Montessori school. And while I myself was not a student, again, this idea of praxis, experiential learning, autonomous education stood out to me not simply as a way of learning the things that needed to be learned, but a methodology of questioning. Though the kids in the school were young, it was a space I first began to think about and observe in practice an idea of teaching being done by non-teachers. So in the case of the school, children co-teaching each other, a space where there's a shared responsibility for a communal process of learning. And central to empowering that process was an understanding how physical space impacts both the mindset of working and our capacity for mutuality. Bodies in space aren't just bodies in space. All of a sudden, all of the odd marginal encounters over the course of my education began to click in. Power structures, praxis, lay education, communities that abdicated the services of the state in order to create a new model for living, an abstraction away from a known enforced way of interacting personally, politically, cosmologically, economically, in order to muddle a way through an alternative structure of world building. Liberation theology and social movement theory at the time, which was also inherently a backward-looking mode of study, very much focused on being outside. The necessity of remove to undermine prescribed roles, to indulge radical ideas, to challenge the state by not participating within the state, to move away from expertise, to undermine power structures that predetermined an existence. What can one get away with when no one is looking? What can one see when nothing is there? Outsideness as a revolutionary potential, outsiderness as a revolutionary potential, otherness. It's slightly embarrassing to admit all of this publicly. It sounds naive or utopian in a way that I don't necessarily think that I am, but this is where praxis actually comes in, moving away from thinking and moving into making. Concurrent to graduate school, which incidentally I never finished, I finally got a job as an administrative assistant at a small nonprofit called Oxbow. It was a school, it was outside of the city, more or less outside of an institution. I saw a lot of parallels in how artists and physicists engaged abstraction. In my mind, a kind of meta-enactment of world building, ways of thinking about things we can't yet see, taking a history and working to undermine or push what was already known into something that wasn't yet existing. And so in my time there, and I think this is when I first started to even conceptualize myself as an educator, I began to think about the implications of the larger narrative of this place, its own origin story, its step away, but also how its particular environment might shape the ideas and ways of working that could happen there. As I mentioned, it was founded in 1910 by artists living and working in the city of Chicago at a time of rapid industrialization and consolidation. This is the time when Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle to describe the conditions of work in the Chicago stockyards. It was the beginnings of the labor movement. The Haymarket riots had taken place 30 years prior, but had launched a public conversation on industrial practices and the rights of workers. So while those important counterbalances were emerging, so too were the structures to which they were responding. So these four individuals wanted out to some extent, to move to a place in order to create an opportunity, even temporarily, of self-determination. While the modes of working were still largely traditional, it reactivated a slower, more intentional way of looking, of relating, and being as open as possible. The things happening in these images were radical at the time, and the experience of being there, while defined by the outside world, was an attempt to deny it. At Oxbow, we used to poke fun at Skowhegan and people's obsession with going. I used to call Oxbow Skowhegan for the people. We even made a poster to hang around SAAC with the tagline, "When you don't get into Skowhegan, try Oxbow." I remember the day I got the job. I cried for hours, both at the prospect of leaving Oxbow, but also about moving into something that I understood from the outside to be more professionalized and consolidated in a way that felt antithetical to how I had been working and thinking. But again, not knowing for me, choosing to engage in what seemed like an oppositional way of working felt important. I knew I needed to both test out some of these ways of working in a different environment, and I also knew I needed to kind of game up. Skowhegan had financial resources and a reputational heft that Oxbow didn't, but that I felt I needed to understand. With the course structure at Oxbow, it was somewhat easier to create an ethos around ideas and art making because truthfully it could just be imposed by me. But in some sense, Skowhegan was even more open than Oxbow. Time was open. There was no true evaluation process. The programmatic structure was essentially just a frame to more or less mark the passing of time in a day and what potential everyone had in determining what could be possible in that time period. And so in some sense, the practice of being at Skowhegan is very much about being together. The expansion of individual practices is for sure the point, but that growth held potential in how the institution was formed each summer by the group that gathered, and again in this notion that sometimes what is familiar is actually the double bind. And gathering, and who is gathering, and how they are gathering became the inflection point. But it's simply not enough to just gather. There's a responsibility that comes with that, which in my mind is part of the failure of so many institutions. So the questions I ask myself as I prepare for Skowhegan, for my own future project, for the world are, what are the roles we should question as teachers and as students? Are some forms of learning violent? How can they become nonviolent? How can learning or unlearning, or whatever this is, be a radical act? What does participation look like? And what is needed to actually promote an equitable participation, or at least the idea of it? What does transmission of knowledge actually look like? And what forms can it be pushed to take? What does access actually look like? Who has been left out and why? How do different understandings or no understanding contribute to a drastically different picture for a future? That was a bad mistake. What does co-education actually require to function? How do you enable and exploit and reconceive evaluation within the studio once we change who is engaged in the dialogue? If the dominant art history isn't my art history, conceptually, materially, representationally, dimensionally, why should I be evaluated in that tradition? Of course I want to know it and I want to learn it, but I also want it to not be a static truth, a universality, a presumed way of being or thinking that supersedes my own. What are the modalities that I want to employ as a part of the responsibility of engaging all of those questions? Our work comes from our histories. So if all of this is true, if I'm unhappy with the world that I have been given, then my responsibility is to interrogate, to the best of my ability, every aspect of how we learn. The unlearning has to be part of the learning. This is important to point out because it runs contrary to so much of what is expected of us as humans, as makers, as students, as teachers. When we are given this space, the openness is intimidating, anxiety-provoking, confusing. But this undefined space is itself what ultimately allows us to reimagine ourselves and our practices, our relationships to others, and our ability to claim space for our voices, our experiences, and our histories. What I've learned myself over time is that mistakes are real, but when we fear them, we remain stuck. What I want to promote is a space for learning that doesn't replicate the oppressive and atomized nature of the world at this particular moment, but instead to engage each other's traumas, histories, aspirations, and ways of working with care, with great responsibility, and the openness to be affected by it, to be changed by it. For me, the meta-conversation has to always be rooted in what we understand or resist understanding as truth or rightness or wrongness. What does it mean if I too am going through this process of inquiry alongside of those I'm supposed to be directing? What does it mean to be 42 and still living in a space that feels so intentionally tenuous? I don't actually know if people get what I'm trying to do when they're at Skowhegan, and I wonder if it's enough to even pose these questions. Is it practice, or is it praxis, or is it still just theorizing? To go back to Freire, is this really a confrontation at all, or is it just a really, really slow one?